I'll be serving as the coordinator for this morning's community forum. This church has a mission to search and to serve, and this forum is an expression of that. We try to bring important information about major topics that affect our lives and our community, and give you the information so that as an audience you can use it in your personal life, in your family, and also your community. Our topic today is Alzheimer's disease and brain health, and our speaker this morning is Dr. Peter Whitehouse, who's an MD and PhD. He's professor of neurology at Case Western Reserve, and he's also been a current and former professor of psychiatry, neuroscience, psychology, cognitive science, bioethics, nursing, history, and organizational behavior at Case and also in Toronto. So he's a man of many talents, and we're looking forward to what he has to say. My own mother died of Alzheimer's disease, and every time I forget a name or forget what I went upstairs for, I worry. And this is true, I think, of most of my peers at this stage of life. And so we hope that Dr. Whitehouse will tell us what's going on here. The Plain Dealer reported recently that we're undergoing an age wave in Ohio, and that by 2025 there will be about 250,000 people with Alzheimer's disease in Ohio, and that the rate of percent of the population over age 60 in Ohio is growing faster than the country in general. So we look forward to hearing Dr. Whitehouse, what he can tell us about how to manage this, how to prepare for it, how to understand it, and Professor Whitehouse.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Thank you for giving me the joy of being here. Seeing your smiling faces here as part of my community. I walked here. It confused Jim because I came to the front door and then the back. What I thought we'd do, and I love the fact that we have in your process a lot of time for questions, thank you, is one microphone. So we're all going to have to remember that lesson when we get to the question part, because I'm going to, depending if you're close enough to reach the microphone, share it with you or repeat the question. And Jim, Ken, and I agreed between the three of us we could probably remember what we said we were going to do. What I'll do is pause in between three segments and ask you if you have specific questions there, just so if I get a sense of whether that clarifies matters that were part of that segment. Then we'll leave most of the time for the questions at the end. Ken, Jim, is that basically what we said? All right, we're off to a rolling start here. We're also off to a very good start because Jim shared the fact that he's had Alzheimer's in the family. And the first thing that happened this morning, and I hope you don't mind because he's also prepared handouts for you, is Jim Rich, as some of you may know, and I'm only sharing these stories because they've been shared with us, has a wife who is in Arden Courts, and Jim has prepared a paper that I've already discussed with Jim. There are parts of this story that I can relate to with a great amount of empathy. But the power of music, the power of going to old restaurants. My wife and I just went to Hunan on the Falls, having not been there for a while. Jim described taking his wife there. And even the power of donuts, which I'm afraid I'm quite... Music and tastes are really deeply a part of our memories and our brains. So thank you, Jim, for sharing that. And he's brought some other copies for anybody that's interested. I thought I would begin the first segment with my journey. So I left my house this morning on Carlton Road, not 22 minutes away from here, and walked, which is, as I mentioned, why I showed up in the wrong place. My wife and I have lived in Shaker Heights for over 30 years and really enjoy this community. In fact, we had the survey people ask us questions. I don't know if you've been, what are they, Trivent or something? The city has hired somebody to take a a survey of us. My wife and I have decided to age in place, which, having raised our 3 daughters, we're going to stay here. But anyway, so I left my house. I had to stop to pick up all the garbage that had been blown out off of the lawn. It was quite windy last night, wasn't it? I did stop to hug a tree. I am a tree hugger and proud of it. And I will end up this first part of my segment talking about trees once again. In fact, some of you may recognize that I'm not wearing my overly leafy tree contest, but I am wearing the Frank Lloyd Wright tree tie. So walking out past the rapid on Cortland, a very important part for us as we age in place. It takes me to the university, which is where I occasionally spend some time, and also to our intergenerational school that my wife and I started, which is down on around Martin Luther King and Shaker Boulevard. That's a charter school where people with who are older go to school with kids. Some of my patients go to school and volunteer in that intergenerational school. Then I passed the library. I was going to say this is the closest location I've had to walk to give to share learning with, but actually right after a book that we published called The Myth of Alzheimer's Disease came out, I went to the library, and there was, I will say, confronted a little bit by a molecular biologist from the Cleveland Clinic and the head of the Alzheimer's Association. What on earth does it mean to write a book called The Myth of Alzheimer's? Well, I think we'll see that in the later segments. Really, what I'm obviously not saying to Jim or to Jimmy. That was confusing for me.
I'm used to being in meetings where the Jims are in the majority.
Well, I'm just sorry we're not meeting in the gym. That would really where was I? Look, it's obvious to all of us that are getting older that our memories aren't quite what they used to be when we were younger. That notion that we're all addressing the challenges of age-related changes to one degree or another. And I think we have to look at that in, this is a community challenge. This is not a challenge for some molecular biologist to fix, in my opinion. We'll get to that. Also, when I gave that talk, I said, I love speaking in libraries. I think the 3rd floor of our house is at risk for collapse, even though I know those sugar heights, because I have, even before I've got hundreds of books on the Kindle, but I've also got a pretty big library. So I said to the people listening to my talk about the myth of Alzheimer's disease in the library, I love being surrounded by multiple neurotransmitter, neuroprotective, lexical enhancement devices. Which only says that if you think brain chemistry is important, it's not all about pills, it's about listening to people and sharing stories, because I can assure you I am affecting some brain chemicals in each one of your mind, even the ones of you that might be beginning to doze off. So absolutely, so the notion of poking fun at the way we traditionally think about things has been part of my career. And so then we passed the middle school, where 3 of my daughters went to middle school. And they've gone on to be pediatricians and nurses and educators and social workers and mothers, 3 daughters. And in fact, our great success, not entirely successful, is that our middle daughter is moving back to this area and has bought a house in Brecksville and is bringing with her our 1.8 grandchildren. So intergenerational aspects of life are what I think is really, really important, and that's the school. And so I'm here. I'm looking at the sign walking in saying kindness is everything. Looking at this sign, I had the opportunity to work with the United Religions Initiative earlier in my career. It's a little like the World Parliament of Religions. Some of you may know about the URI, started by Bishop Swing in California. And this notion that I in that process, actually worked with, now if you throw me out now, I understand, but I doubt you will. I might get thrown out in other places, with the neo-pagans, with the earth-based religions, the indigenous peoples. So I sometimes consider myself a Celtic Buddhist shaman. Now, the tree is obviously part of the shamanism. Now, you heard that. I'm almost at the end of my story, but telling the story, I hope will kind of get a sense of what you might think is worthwhile putting in our shared conversation space and what might not be. If you want an advice about which drug company stock to buy, this is not the place to. I think I took on this performance character, the tree doctor, because I think it's really, really important that we understand the biological importance of trees, but also the cultural importance of our relationships to trees. And I'm interested in language, and so the idea that trees are intensely metaphorical. They build bridges. They help tell us to pay important attention to our roots. They talk about, I love that you've got water on your sign out there. The idea of water as a key part of the animation of our planet, if not the universe, I think is absolutely essential. So here's the ending story, which begins the tree in my backyard back to Unitarianism. Because this is going to be a test with me, maybe you. Welcome. As you heard, I have a number of different academic appointments, so I make fun of university. So I am a transdisciplinarian. I'm beyond inter, I'm trans. We can talk about what that means. Actually, being trans these days is actually becoming somewhat more acceptable in a number of different ways. So I'm going to participate in an international transdisciplinary conference in Transylvania. And you know what I call my character? Sylvanus. Now, some of you would guess that Sylvanus is the god of forests, right? Actually, that's partly true, but he's also, and there are several of them, so I'll call them Sylvani. The Sylvani are gods of borders, the borders between forests and fields, and the guardians of shepherds, and the borders between our fields and our forests. So this notion that the borders of things, the ecotomes, who look at Nancy and say the places where creativity biologically and culturally is going on. But of course, when I'm in Transylvania, I am of course going to go into the forests, and I will try to also, since I'll be in Cluj-Napoca, where Frank David. And this is the test question. I mean, he started the Unitarian Church in Romania, right?
Right.
Right. There you go. So I did a little homework. But anyway, so here we are. Me, the tree, is going to Transylvania to go to the world's most haunted forest to seek out dimensions to my spiritual relationship to nature in those wonderful forests that surround that particular part of Romania. All right. I'm actually going to stop. That's the first segment. We already got 1/3 of the way through. So do you have any questions about what I just said? Please repeat it. I am a trans... Oh, God, you're pulling my leg. You know, what's interesting about that is I would never repeat that the same way, would I? As a speaker, you're constantly kind of scanning the audience, seeing what jokes work and what jokes don't work. So far I'm looking for one that does work, so help me out. Anybody got any questions about who I have become? Yes, sir. Okay, a question from a fellow doctor. He's a gastroenterologist, as you all know. This is dangerous. Go ahead, sir.
I read an article recently about dementia, and it said, it was in Harper's Magazine, and it said that people with dementia are generally happy, at least as happy as the rest of society, and that we should lose some of our fear of dementia for that reason. That they still have also a sense of their personhood. They see themselves as, in some ways, who they always were. You know, you're talking about engagement with the younger generation and getting out in nature and so forth. Could you comment on that?
So I will, and that's a lovely segue into the second part, which is on, a traditional medical category of diagnosis, and the third part, which is about treatment. I should have kind of told you where we were going. Needless to say, I think you can imagine that my conceptions of that aren't quite the standard ones that you will read in most of the mainstream media, which creates this fear that this is the worst thing that could happen to you, that your life is over. There's a movie called Monster in the Mind, which, speaking of Romania, involves Dracula, because this notion that we actually consider people with dementia as zombies, that they have lost their humanity but they're still alive, is part of this fear message that is designed to support a particular view that the only thing we should be focusing on, I'm exaggerating slightly, is curing it. So this notion is so bad. And let me just put one little barb at the Alzheimer's Association for a minute, not locally. When they said, we've got to do something, they've got a goal of finding an effective drug by 2025, curing it. They said, if we don't do this, it's not only going to be terrible for everybody and every family who's affected, which is probably most people in this room to one degree or another, it's going to bankrupt our Medicare system. It's going to cost us so much that our entire society is going to collapse. I'm not exaggerating. When they did that changing trajectory report and started talking about what a medicine might do and how much money that they would save if we had that money, they made some rather fallacious arguments. But let me just tell you the most obvious problem with their report, Changing Trajectory. Guess what they estimated the cost of the drug that would save us these hundreds of billions of dollars was going to be?
4,000 miles.
Zero. They modeled and claimed that if we had this drug, we would save all this money. Modeling the cost of the drug is zero, which must have surprised a lot of pharmaceutical companies. That's irresponsible. That is creating fear, and it is creating fear at the level not only of individuals, but at the level of society. And we have to be very cautious. Kindness is what we need. And there are lots of people who are very kind to lots of people with dementia. And I think that caring, that they say, here's the motto. The most commonly quoted motto is, care today, cure tomorrow. Do you really think that we're going to cure tomorrow so we don't have to care tomorrow too? I had one mother thought about that, but I think that was, if that's an example of how I answer questions or address questions, we're in real trouble. We'll get about 3 questions in, so I better stop. Okay, but it is a good segue into diagnosis. All right. What are we trying to diagnose? Jim used the word dementia. We've been talking about Alzheimer's. How many of you have heard of mild cognitive impairment? I'm going to say former friend, because I'm getting irritated at him, Ron Peterson, was not the first, but the first one to promote that concept. Mild cognitive impairment is a stage of memory and other thinking difficulties. We'll call it memory, but it's other things as well. And it's very variable, as we'll get to in a minute. But mild cognitive impairment is something where theoretically you don't have any impairments of activities of daily living. Now, how many of you have tried to upgrade your computer? Right? So a lot of us have activities of daily impairment. In fact, I would say this would make a lot more men demented than women. That was a sexist. That was a sexist. Okay. Speaking from personal experience, I'm somewhat impaired at some domestic activities of daily living. By the way, if you want to ask the question I was going to ask in terms of Jim's comment a minute ago, how well is the human race doing at activities of daily living in general? Do you think any of us have the cognitive capacity, the decision-making capability to fathom the depths of our horrible impact on the planet and what we're doing to future generations. So the idea that that a part of wisdom is humility, and we all ought to be a little humble about our own cognitive abilities, I think is important. With the exception, of course, the few presidents that call themselves genii. Okay, so this is an important question because you will hear all the time that we need to diagnose things early, right? That is the mantra internationally. We've got to diagnose things early. Well, I guess we should be diagnosing mild cognitive impairment. But should we be diagnosing early mild cognitive impairment or late mild cognitive impairment? Yes, those categories exist. And I once said they would invent a category called pre-mild cognitive impairment, and they did. And do you know what the earlier category before that is? By the way, with mild cognitive impairment, you do have some cognitive test performance problems if there are some objective things that are demonstrated. Okay, so the one before that is subjective cognitive impairment, SCI.
That's the stage we're in.
So I warn my patients, don't complain about your memory because that automatically gives you a diagnosis of subjective cognitive impairment. It gets worse, or better, depending on how you see it. Now, how many of you have heard about amyloid, an amyloid PET scan? That's the latest craze, and I use craze as a technical term here, almost psychotic. Now we're doing studies of people that may not have any complaints, may not have any objective psychological tests, but have a brain image that shows amyloid in their heads. So we're thinking about treating people who have no symptoms, have no complaints, but they've got a brain imaging abnormality. I should point out that the famous nun study, where they studied in nuns over time who developed memory problems and who didn't, 30 to 40% of the nuns who didn't have any significant problems with thinking abilities or dysfunction had amyloid in their brain. I'm going to make some rude comment about Catholics. Not they're not. Kindness is the best thing. So the point is, the early. How much earlier can you go than that? And this one really gets kind of complicated. There are some forms of so-called Alzheimer's disease that are quite genetic. So genetic that if you have these are rare. I should say to those people that have concerns, they are people who have usually get the symptoms under the age of 60 or even 50. But the form of Alzheimer's that is the early onset familial form has autosomal dominant mutations. Now, you don't have to know the technical term. All you need to know is that means that if your mother or your father have that form of Alzheimer's, you have a 50-50 chance of inheriting the gene and getting it yourself. So now we're going to be diagnosing people on the basis of genes. You could diagnose a baby in utero with the gene for that form of Alzheimer's. And let me just say that is rare, again. So I've just said the diagnostic area is quite confusing, even if we don't talk about the genetics and don't talk about the subjective and cognitive impairment. But basically what the pharmaceutical company would love is to sell the amyloid imaging and sell the drug that dissolves your amyloid and almost never have to have anybody talk to a patient. That's a caricature, but it's really true. I mean, think of cholesterol. Manage your numbers. We are being quantitated. And the numbers are important, but it's not everything to life, and it's not everything to health. We are roaring through here, so I would say that's a reasonable point to stop and talk about diagnoses. Yes, sir.
So,
A number of medications have been tried for Alzheimer's, and generally they've had very little effect. And the reason given is usually that they have been instituted too late, and there's already major damage or major loss. And so what you're saying is that, I guess my thinking is that you want to know early before symptoms occur if the disease is there, so the chance of intervening is better. Is that wrong?
So I didn't plan him. I'm really wondering what his question for the third segment is, because that's going to be the conversation for the fourth part of the talk, which isn't going to occur. So we're going to talk about treatment next, but let's connect what you said to diagnosis. In medicine, it's almost sacrosanct that early diagnosis is better. Of course, early diagnosis is better when there is a specific therapy that you can offer that matches to that diagnosis. I'm not saying that diagnosis is only important to link it to therapy. Clearly, prognosis is important. Maybe you have an incurable cancer, but you want to know, because you want to know something about whatever the doctors know about the rate of progression of your illness. The problem with Alzheimer's is, let's forget all the earlier ones for a minute, is I don't think it's one condition. That is the major message of the myth of Alzheimer's disease. And actually, I don't think there's any doctor or any family member or any long-term care provider who has had the experience of meeting with more than one patient with the label Alzheimer's who doesn't respect the fact that there's an enormous amount of variability in how people start, continue, and rate of progression also. So if I say you have Alzheimer's, that you could be dead in 2 years. You could actually not get any worse. I mean, it really is. That's, when we've done all these big studies, clear that even the rate of progression is very variable. Now, unfortunately, most people, it does progress over a matter of years, and it does get worse. And again, I want to go back to the message that I said to you before. This is real. I mean, it's not standing up here saying Alzheimer's is a myth, meaning that age-related memory problems that get worse aren't real. That would be absolutely ludicrous. But the idea that in a situation where this is such a complex problem, we have to begin by framing things right. And if we label everybody with Alzheimer's one thing, then it leads to this expectation we're going to find one cure. So if you're willing to embrace the notion of heterogeneity, then at least you have to ask the biologists what's the range of heterogeneity and how many different biological interventions are we going to have to meet this challenge. So it raises the stakes around simplistic thinking that tends to go on in medicine. If we just find the gene, then we'll find the protein. Then, forgetting epigenetics for a minute, we'll just find the drug that impacts that condition. So I think the heterogeneity of Alzheimer's disease challenges our simplistic thinking that simple molecular approaches will be the answer. I'm not talking against science. I am a scientist. I'm more a Unitarian than I am than I believe in scientism. Now, you have a poster out there about the power of science, and that's great. I think religion and science do have a lot of conversation to have between each other. But when we put our faith in scientific solutions, as we have a tendency to do, particularly in this country, that's scientism, and I think that's a problem. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason to diagnose somebody early would be if we have an effective therapy, or if you think we're going to have an effective therapy, or if you want people to enroll in trials. So the experts are desperate at the moment because people are not enrolling in trials in adequate numbers. So they want you to be diagnosed early so they can participate in trials. The other thing that people say, I'll get your question in a second because this is my last comment, is, well, why should we diagnose early if we don't have a therapy? Some people say, well, I want to give people lifestyle advice. I want them to walk from their house in Shaker Heights to the Unitarian Church instead of drive. I want them to learn to dance, to engage in music, to do things that are that will keep their brain healthy. Well, who doesn't need that advice? So the advice to improve your life is true for every one of us. It's pretty generic. I think physicians ought to be doing more of that, frankly. But it's not clear to me that you give specific advice based on a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Okay. Questions for the end of phase 2?
You implied in your conversation that there were other features besides cognitive impairment associated with what we generally describe as all. Would you describe some of those other features?
So, cognition is a pretty broad term that focuses more on the intellect. So many people will focus on memory problems. I would say that the other one to focus on is attention, is multitasking, is the ability to zero in on some aspect of what you're trying to solve. So people's attention fluctuate. Other things that are more variable include language. So some people have no difficulty in the use of words. They may have a difficulty having the right thoughts to express the words, whereas other people have lots of problems with language early on. The other problem that I think is really fascinating is, and I say fascinating, please forgive me, when somebody has this problem, it isn't fascinating at all. It can be visual agnosia, problems interpreting the visual world. So there are stories of people who, well, the visual spatial world includes getting lost. So some people get lost, some people don't get lost. That's, for example, one of my activities of daily living problem. I've lived in this community for 30 years, and when I drive with my wife, it's like, wait a minute, where are you going? So part of the manifestations of Alzheimer's, what we call Alzheimer's disease, is what kind of abilities you have in the first place, which is partly why it's variable. Okay, so visual spatial. Another one that's challenging is executive functions. Now that will allow me to say another thing. There are other forms of dementia, which is the broader category, besides the category that we call Alzheimer's, and those are called frontal lobe dementias. Have you ever spent any time appreciating your frontal lobes? So look in the mirror. Right? They're really important. Right back here, because that's the executive functions. That's the other name that we use for that. So a lot of your decision making, a lot of your wisdom, a lot of your integration of emotions and thinking goes on in the frontal lobe. So some people have more trouble with executive function. There's another whole class, and that is the so-called non-cognitive or behavioral. So some people get really agitated, some people don't. Some people have hallucinations. They see things that aren't there. Some people don't. Some people have delusions that somebody's out to hurt them. Now, but they're complicated and related. Let's say somebody keeps thinking that somebody has stole their pocketbook. Well, it could just be they forget where they put the pocketbook, but they have an inclination to become paranoid, and so they think somebody's stealing it from them. So these non-cognitive behavioral symptoms are really an important part of it as well, and that could be a whole long conversation too about how you deal with those issues. More questions about diagnosis then? Yes?
What role does personality change play in this? My mother was had a dementia problem, and one of the things that I found was that she became so much nicer, because she had been an angry person much of her life, and she had forgotten what she was angry at. and of course, in other instances, people have had exactly the opposite sort of problem. They repress the anger, and suddenly it's, the sensor is gone. So how does that relate to this whole issue of cognitive change?
So by the way, I just taught a little course on wising up, and this notion of where humor fits into wisdom and life in general, I think is really important. And that's one of the problems with the fear model, if we have so much fear associated with that, drives lots of other thinking out, including sense of humor. You are not the first to report that I'm not saying you were claiming, I'm just saying, I'm building on your experience. Eleanor Fuchs, the professor of dramaturgy at Yale that I've done some work with, wrote a whole book on her mother, who was really had a bad relationship with the daughter, and there are several other books like this where, because of the change in the disease manifest, the relationship got a bit better, and I would even say deeper at times. We have this sense that goes back to Jim's original observation that when people have a label of dementia, they're kind of gone. You know, you can't have a deep relationship with them. That you can't. When long-term memories are relatively intact, when they can sing the songs that they knew, from earlier on in life, the power of engaging with people at that level of reminiscence of, and that's why it's so important intergenerationally. I mean, we have people who may not be able to remember what they had for breakfast in our schools, but they can tell the kids about what it was like to march with Martin Luther King. That's amazing. And that's a person with dementia.
You might point out that neurology is really the frontier of medical science.
Is that your? Do you want me to repeat that?
Sure.
Well,
I can usually elaborate on that, sure.
You might point out that neurology is really the frontier of medical science, and progress is very slow and pretty uncertain. My father died of Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, in 1959. We don't know much more about it today than we did now.
So, yes, I'm a neuroscientist and I'm a neurologist and I'm on the frontier. These gastroenterologists, I can forget. Other than the fact that they think the microbiome, the 3 pounds of bacteria in your gut, are more important. Jim too, if I can begin to do that. Absolutely, science is phenomenally exciting. We live in an era where I don't know what is more important. Put a man on the moon, we mapped the human genome, we developed a computer that could beat people at Go in Jeopardy. That's pretty amazing what has happened in our lifetime. That said, we are in what's been called the Great Acceleration. Do you know how many people were living on the planet when I was born, which was 1949? I didn't even actually know this. It's a number that, for me, I take really personally. 2.5 billion. That was only 68 years ago. There are now triple that. That's frightening. And frankly, when I look out at the weather this morning, every time I look at the weather and it's a little bit weird, I'm thinking that's related in some sense to the great changes that are happening in climate. So we're in a race, Jim. I don't think to understand our brains as much as just understand who we are as human beings in relationship to our responsibility to these great planetary forces. To the extent that neurologists and neuroscience can contribute to that, more power to us. That said, the hype about how much we know about the brain, how much we know about our genetic makeup, how much we know about things that are reductionistic. We want to reduce human beings to genes, we want to reduce them to their brains. That's scientism, that's dangerous in my view. So we should not give up on the excitement that we have as human beings to be learners, to discover new things. I'm resonating with you. But in this modern, if not postmodern era, we're talking about geoengineering. We're talking about engaging the planet and trying to change the climate. We have got to be really careful about having a sense of what our science and what our brains can tell us, and what to switch metaphors here, what our hearts can tell us about all this. So, yeah, I mean, I wrote an article for a book on the scientific neuroturn, which was, and by the way, there's a whole book written by a historian on the word neuro. Here's my essay. A clinical neuroscientist looks neuroskeptically at neuroethics and the neuro world. Because if you make, we got neurophilosophy, we've got neuro leadership, we've got neurotheology, we've got neuro everything, right? What we have to ask deeply, what does it mean that we have that neuro in front of it? How many of you have heard about neuroplasticity? Okay. Well, that is the big marketing of this group of people, of which I'm somewhat one. What they've discovered is the brain can change. Wow! Even before Aristotle thought the brain was a radiator, but let's just say for the moment that we had to discover the brain had something to do with thinking. But even before, when we discovered that, even before, don't you think people knew the brain could change? Didn't Socrates think when he was talking to people he was changing their brains? I'm not sure I'm getting my Greek scholarship there correctly. But the fact is, psychoplasticity, education, socioplasticity, culture change doesn't get the play that neuroplasticity does. Neuroplasticity implies that the answer lies in a drug or a brain intervention. And that's the danger of it, that you put your resources, as I was talking about with Alzheimer's, into something that is focused too much on affecting the nerve cells.
And then you have to take another drug to counteract the side effects.
Tell me about how many, the word iatrogenic. Psychiatrists are great at this. They give you one drug, and then they give you another drug for the side effect, then they give you another drug for a side effect. I'm exaggerating only slightly, because the average number of people in this country are on lots of pills. Take statins. I'm not going to ask, but I would say relatively few people would raise their hands and not be on a statin. A lot of people, older people, complain about memory and complain about being a little weak and tired and having some muscle aches. Well, that's two of the side effects of statins. So now I'm going to create a rush of all you calling your doctors about statins. Let's say you run till 10:45, right? Okay. So we're doing okay. I've got one more segment, which we've already been introducing, which is treatment. And then we'll open it up for the rest of the time for questions. Yes?
My father was diagnosed with dementia, but I think it was from a series, not from, Alzheimer's. Aren't there a lot of other things that are kind of misdiagnosed? Because everybody treated him like he had Alzheimer's.
Yeah. That's absolutely a good question that relates to this issue of we're trying to compartmentalize people into specific categories. This is like false modesty or a lack of humility. So I'm giving a talk to the stroke group at Harvard on Friday. I'm actually doing something similar to this, which is going to be even more challenging because kindness is not part of the argument. That is the guy who invited me is a nice guy, but he basically studies vascular dementia. Everybody's probably had some experience with somebody who's had a stroke, and we know that that can affect cognition. So when I was a young upstart, I was going around saying, you guys got it all wrong. This is not arteriosclerotic dementia. This is not hardening of the arteries. Now we call it multi-infarct dementia or vascular. This is Alzheimer's. I'm going to ask this guy at Harvard, do you agree with me that we know less about the differences between Alzheimer's and vascular dementia today than we did back then? The answer to that is yes, because for many, many reasons. Most people who are older don't have dementia for one reason. The most common form of dementia in this country is not Alzheimer's, it's mixed dementia. It's a combination of vascular factors and factors that Alzheimer's disease focuses on, which is the loss of nerve cells. The ultimate irony of all that is, what do you do to prevent heart attacks and stroke? Now, don't say take your statins. Yeah, yes, you do, but you watch your diet, you exercise, you try to make sure you don't get diabetes, you Control high blood pressure, right? Have we all learned that lesson about how we try to prevent vascular disease, whether it be in the heart or the brain? Guess what the studies show, to the extent we can even separate them, you should do if you want to prevent Alzheimer's disease. Same things. So it's like, what is that telling us? So yes, the uncertainty we have about clearly differentiating the different types of dementia, it's completely opposite from what we expected. We expected all the genetic testing, all the imaging to allow us to make more precise separations between people. In fact, I would say not only is the lesson of heterogeneity true, but the lesson of the difficulties we have in categorizing that heterogeneity in the categories we've been using all along. Sir?
Bringing you back to Earth from science, how do you see it playing out?
Bring
you back to Earth. How do you see it playing out in the real world when you might have to pay a little bit more to rent a car? You're over 65. Maybe you can't drive a car when you're 80. Maybe they won't allow you to be professor of neurology after an arbitrary age. How do you see this playing out, relating science, genetic testing, and so on to your actual functioning? Because society's giving us rules now.
Well, I mean, that's interesting because I saw the green line pass me by and I thought, gee, for $1 I could have just hopped up 2 steps. And by the way, the best bargain aside from that is the National Park Senior Pass. The price went up, but get that right away if you like national parks. So we do treat older people in different ways. The university, to make that go into that direction, cannot get rid of people at the base of age. They can actually step down from administrative positions, but I stepped down from administrative positions a long time ago. So I don't expect that that's going to color. But
I just threw out examples.
No, I know.
Look,
You're asking a very complicated question, which relates to, I think, if I interpret it right, ageism. What are you allowed and not allowed to do in society on the basis of age? I'm thickly involved in that debate. I'm part of the planning committee and will be speaking in the 9th International Positive Aging Conference. We're trying to change aging from something negative to something positive. We're trying to look at older people as a resource, not as a drain. But here's my question to you, and then my question to all my colleagues who talk about ageism. I ask you, is ageism just against older people, or is it against anybody on the basis of age?
Yes.
Let's have a show of hands. Let me tell you my spiel, because I'm going to increase the number of hands in support. So I say I'm an intergenerational neurologist. My father was a pediatrician, my daughter's a pediatrician. I say, look at these young guys in our intergenerational school. If they're going to become elders, we have to make sure that we do right by our children in this society, not just by elders. I also say all the time, how many of you made a joke about a millennial? Well, that's ageism, right? It's discriminating them because they are of a different age. Okay, so how many of you think ageism should be just applied to discriminating unfairly against older people? Whoa! I won't even ask the question. Unanimous. Maybe I'm just too threatening a speaker, I don't know. But you're into some really complicated issues. I personally think we are reinventing aging. Why could you not be an adolescent in 1899?
The concept that you invented?
Exactly.
What was it?
The concept of adolescence wasn't invented until G. Stanley Hall invented it in about 1905. I think we're developing something that I don't like the term, called midolescence or adulthood 2. That is a time where we are, fortunately, thanks to medicine and public health and many other things, healthier than our parents might have been at the particular time of chronological age. So depending on where you are, say the time you retire, my wife's retired, I'm never going to retire. It's a good combination. It means I don't have to learn so many activities of daily living. But I'm going to get I'm sorry my wife didn't come this morning. The idea that there is this period of active wisdom, of active aging, positive aging. And we have an enormous responsibility as people who are no longer frail, who are not yet frail, to play a role in society that I think we have more opportunity to play that role because there are more of us living into that time period. I don't think that was the answer you expected, but I really didn't understand the full depth of your question, so I just waxed eloquent. Yes.
So, what's happening in the human brain when you get Alzheimer's?
What is happening in the Alzheimer's brain when you get Alzheimer's? Well, first I've said that Alzheimer's is not one thing. The first thing people would say would go back to the plaques, right? The amyloid. That's the feature that gets a lot of attention because most of the therapies we're really going to have a time to talk about are directed towards that particular protein. Those occur in people that don't have dementia, just as they occur in the nuns that have the positive amyloid. So that people are puzzled as to whether that's it. The other feature is neurofibrillary tangles. Those are inside neurons that relate, I think, more directly to the death of neurons. So the answer to Jan's question is lots of things, variable things, but basically it's called a neurodegenerative disease, meaning that the target of what's going on is a loss of nerve cells. That occurs in lots of conditions, including aging, to one degree or another.
Question. You said loss of nerve what?
Cells.
Cells.
Neurons.
I didn't hear cells.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry. Well, that's why when I was talking about we thought, it seems to have some reason. You either got a problem with your blood vessels, that's a vascular dementia or a stroke, or you got problems with your nerve cells. That's a form of degenerative disease like so-called Alzheimer's. Parkinson's disease is a degenerative disease that affects different nerve cells. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, is a very unfortunate disease that affects motor neurons, nerve cells that control movement, so people become essentially progressively paralyzed. So, Jan, and by the way, you have to tell Michael, your husband, who's I'm sure you all know is a neurologist, somebody walked in here and said something like, I think he was being rude to me. No, he was being kind. But you knew Michael and you worked with Michael and none of it's rubbed off. And I said, tell him this. I said, wait, which direction are you talking about the rubbing off thing? However, I will say that the thing I said to that person was some of Michael's critique, some of his humor. I said some of his Irish humor. Some of his is not his speaking truth to power. I would like to think I inherited, including also for those of you that know Dr. Joseph Foley from him as well. All right, so Jan, a lot of things are going on. Basically, it's a loss. We don't really know why the nerve cells die. We don't really know why some people die. The nerve cells die faster than others, and why they, in some diseases, die in different parts of the brain. All right, we're doing a lot of questions at the end of this period, so we're not going to have quite as much time for questions at the end of that, which is fine with me. But please, last question for this period.
As a trans thinker and someone who has presented to us the point that Alzheimer's is a heterogeneous illness, if you ran the world, I mean, have you come up in terms of diagnosis with a more holistic survey of your patient universe when someone comes into you? And what role does oxygen in the brain play in Alzheimer's?
Okay, great. So that is another good transition. So if I had all the money in the world, what would I do to address this problem, and how would I address the issue of oxygen? I would plant more trees, because I think we've got to address oxygen at the level of the balance between carbon dioxide and oxygen. But clearly the brain dies for lots of reasons, this degenerative process we were talking about. So there are parts of the brain that are very sensitive to lack of oxygen. One of those is a structure called the hippocampus, which is very important for memory. So there are people who have a cardiac arrest, who come back, who don't die, but aren't intact, who have terrible troubles with recent memory. So oxygen is important. Oxygen is important if you have a stroke, if you drop a blood vessel. And oxygen is important in understanding the metabolism of cell loss in Alzheimer's as well, as is blood sugar and diabetes. I think in the blurb for this today, I was supposed to talk about whether Alzheimer's disease was type 3 diabetes. That's marketing. That's marketing. There's clearly more going on than just diabetes. That said, I'm part of a group that's studying intranasal insulin in Alzheimer's. You can make an argument for lots and lots of things being affected in Alzheimer's disease, including dysregulation of glucose. But I don't think it's the whole answer. Now, thank you for that lead-in. What would I do if I had all the money in the world to address the social challenge of what happens to our memory as we get older? I would enhance the funding for innovative public education. I happen to think intergenerational schools are a good idea, but the idea that if you look across all the studies about what protects us from getting late life dementia, education. Education is the most protective factor that exists, short of never getting old, which is a little hard to do. So we don't know why, because there are lots of things associated with being better educated. A fundamental one is you may be born with more brain capacity and therefore can take advantage and get into high-performing educational circumstances. So it may be you're just born with a better brain. It may be that the process of education itself can be protected. So that's one thing. I say all the time, if we wanted to improve the health, let's focus on health for a minute, of Cleveland, we would enhance public education. We would not give more money to hospitals. Because it takes, as Jocelyn Elder said, a healthy kid to learn and a kid that learns to know how to stay healthy. So that's one thing. I have not gotten to the American Neurological Association in decades, but I joined the governing council of the American Public Health Association because I think if we want to address this challenge, we have to meet this at a community and a public health level. For example, the lead levels in kids in Cleveland are higher, the lead levels of kids in Cleveland are higher than in Flint, Michigan. And we know that if you don't take care of these little young people that I was talking about and their brain health, they're more likely to become demented later on. By the way, the good news is that the rates of dementia are going down, age-specific rates in some countries. The overall number is going up because there are more older people, but there are places, and this has been replicated in a number of places in Europe and in North America, where the rates are going down. That's probably because we improve public health, largely, and perhaps the control of hypertension. And perhaps because we took lead out of gasoline and lead out of paint. So it's even possible we inadvertently already have evidence. It's very hard to interpret that evidence in the public health space. And there's one last thing I would say. The policies that I'm working on with the American Public Health Association and the Royal Society for Public Health involve art, music, dance. If I would say one specific thing that I would recommend to you to do, and maybe I was going to tell you at the end of my talk, I'm going to go back and do some walking meditation back to my house, but maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should dance back to my house. Might provoke a certain amount of, because dancing is, what the new sitting is, the new smoking. I mean, I'm the only one staying fit here. The rest of you guys are sitting. I am walking around a lot, you notice that. My father, the pediatric neurologist, diagnosed me with attention deficit hyperactivity. I've never been medicated. Where were we? So I would go beyond just public health in the traditional things, like, okay, there's a big movement to create age-friendly communities. Have you been part of that? Cleveland is a part of that. My hometown, London, was the first capital city to do that. Massachusetts was the first state to become an age-friendly state. There's now another movement of which I'm part called dementia-friendly communities. We're trying to make, a lot of that is about first responders and shopkeepers and people in the community, helping them understand how older people can have challenges, how people with dementia can have challenges. I actually proposed at a meeting on autism, we ought to have autism-friendly communities. Wait. Shouldn't we just have friendlier communities in which people are educated about the range of human variability across the lifespan and are more tolerant to people that have cognitive challenges? And I think part of making communities friendly is arts. I am teaching using museums as places for learning. Meet at MoMA was a program that started bringing people with dementia to art museums. The funny thing about that was my friend who did the research had to code the name badges because they would bring their caregivers in order to identify which was the person that was the caregiver. I'm serious. I mean, modern art makes us all demented, right? So that's what I would do. Now, what is being done, though, is we're spending an enormous amount of money to try to develop vaccines to get rid of amyloid one way or another. These have consistently failed, but the trouble with failure in an industry which, A, has invested so much money in a particular approach that it's too big to fail, and B, that hires so many lawyers and so many liars to convince us that marginally effective drugs are worth it anyway. Just reviewing the new guidelines at the FDA, and if we're not careful, what I said a minute ago is going to come to pass. We will have a worthless drug, largely worthless drug, that we pay a lot of money for, where the opportunity costs of not doing other things are not realized. The opportunity gains are not realized. Because they would like us to just approve drugs on the basis of amyloid imaging, for example. So I was a drug lord. That's what I call them now. I go to meetings of drug lords occasionally. What does that mean? That means I'm sure it doesn't happen in gastroenterology. There is a great concern I have about the medical profession, that we have bought into particular models of health that have been sold to us and to the general population by pharmaceutical companies. I'm not saying that pharmaceuticals don't have some benefit, but I'm saying they're way overpriced, literally and figuratively. They're overpriced because they're too expensive, and they're overpriced because focusing so much on the drugs means we don't focus on other things. When your career has been invested in trying to find a cure for Alzheimer's disease, it's hard to back off from that. It's hard to say we should be focusing on public health, we should be focusing on art museums, or whatever. And I could spend a long time telling you about the history of drug development in Alzheimer's disease. I was very much involved in it. I started an organization that was the only organization I ever started that had the mission statement in its title, the International Working Group for the Harmonization of Dementia Drug Guidelines. Because before we had any drugs, we didn't know how we should approve them. What would be the criteria? What should a drug do before you allow the FDA to say this is approved? And that was happening in Europe, it was happening in Japan, it was happening in the United States. So we put together a group that would study just how do we determine the social value of drugs. The system I worked on were the ones that led the drugs, Aricept and Razidine and others. They're cholinesterase inhibitors. That means that they block the breakdown of an important neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. If I wanted to make you all amnestic for this event, I would have asked you to put on 2 of those seasickness patches. Scopolamine, it blocks acetylcholine. Putting 2 on would have probably made you amnestic for this entire event. Scopolamine blocks cholinergic systems, so we tried to develop ways of enhancing the cholinergic systems by drugs that work the opposite from drugs that block it. So that was basically the first 20 years that led to the current generation of drugs, which unfortunately, although provable scientifically to do some things to memory that is good, the net benefit is not what we hope to be. Which is then when the doctors discovered the genes for amyloid and found that some of those genes were affected in early onset, the strongly genetic form, they marked down this molecular genetic pathway that says all we have to do is target amyloid and we're going to find the cure. And I'm not exaggerating the number of times the word cure is used. My own personal ambition is to cure the dementia field of using the word cure.
Amen. My experience with my father, 50 years and they haven't found out much.
50 years, I'm sorry, Jim?
50 years and they haven't learned much about Lou Gehrig's disease.
Well, they're tough conditions. And the other reason that I've alluded to, the reason they're tough, there's a rather small line between what we're trying to do in Alzheimer's and what you read a lot about. Anti-aging medicine. You know, it's a huge industry. Billions of dollars are being spent by people to keep themselves young. This goes back to what we were talking about with regards to your question, just what is the role of older people to spend a lot of money acting young? It supports the economy, but I'm afraid it supports the economy of people who make false promises. But the promise that we will cure Alzheimer's is very close scientifically to the promise that we will cure aging, because the biological changes that go on in some of these neurodegenerative conditions mimic the biological conditions that go on in things we call disease. All of you have a little bit of memory difficulty to one degree or another. Maybe not all of you, most of you have some degree. Probably most of you could not run the marathon with the speed that you could. Your motor systems are slowing down. So the motor systems is, I mean, you know, so here's the evolution. I've never done this before. This is a tree walking. From a young gait to an older gait to Parkinson's disease. All right, I kind of did therapy rather quickly, but I told you that my real belief is that this is a matter of community. This is a matter of how we organize, and since my wife and I have decided to age in place in Shaker Heights, our fate is in your hands. Let's create friendlier communities and let's look at those priorities, because if we do that, a lot of people are going to be happier, not just people with dementia.
So the service begins at 11 o'clock upstairs, and everybody is welcome. I don't know the sermon today, I'm afraid, but there is a church auction after the service today. And there will be wonderful things auctioned off to raise funds for the church, and we hope that you can all come and have a good time and contribute to a very worthy cause. Next week we are having a change in the format. We're going to have what's called a Sanibel discussion. And I don't know if you've gone to Sanibel Island in the winter, but they have twice a week they have community discussions. And our discussion next week will be led by our own Bob Horan and Mark Weber. And they will raise questions about important issues in the news now, like the Nunez memo or the Mueller investigation, or whether the Me Too movement is changing feminism, or should college basketball players be paid, or was it right for the city to undertake part of the expense of renewing the basketball arena downtown. So all sorts of local and national and international topics will be raised, and they will ask you, the audience, to bring your opinions. And all opinions will be respected and appreciated, and I think it'll make for a very lively discussion, so I hope you can all attend for that. The following week will be the community breakfast here, and so once again, I'd like to thank Professor Whitehouse for a wonderful talk.
for White